Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Lockwood, and I'm your host for the Inclusion Bites podcast. In this series, I have interviewed a number of amazing people and simply had a conversation about the subject of inclusion, belonging, and generally making the world a better place for everyone to thrive. If you'd like to join me in the future, then please do drop me a line to joe.lockwood@seechangehappen.co.uk. That's SEE changehappen.co.uk. You can catch up with all of the previous shows on iTunes, Spotify, and the usual places. So plug in your headphones, grab a decaf, and let's get going. Today is episode 39, with the title, Viewing Gender Through a Fresh Perspective. And I have the absolute honour and privilege to be joined by Antoinette Dale Henderson. Antoinette describes herself as a TEDx speaker, a two-time author, and founder of the Gravitas program. When I asked Antoinette to describe her superpower, she said, she always chooses to see the best in people, and her superpower is enabling others to see that in themselves. Hello, Antoinette. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Joanne. It's amazing to be here.
I've been looking forward to this. We've known each other a couple of years, and through lockdown, we've not had the chance to catch up. So this is going to be really amazing. So Thank you for coming on.
I'm looking forward to it.
So I call this episode Viewing Gender Through a Fresh Perspective. What does that mean to you?
Well, it's interesting because I have, over the past 3 years or so, found myself working more and more in the space of helping women in leadership really further their careers. And that really came as a result of my work in the corporate world. So I've worked with men and women, anybody. And, you know, what I noticed was that it was often women who are coming to me and saying, I'm experiencing confidence issues. I'm experiencing, that second pandemic of the 21st century. I'm experiencing imposter syndrome, or I'm really holding myself back and I need your help. And so I was inspired probably about 3 years ago to start looking at how I could put together some programs and really some solutions to help further women in business. And that coincided with the whole Me Too movement, where women started to call out really inappropriate behavior and stand up for themselves and say enough is enough. And then at the same time, looking at the gender pay gap, that was also starting to happen about 2 years ago. And so that inspired me to write my second book, which is Power Up, the Smart Woman's Guide to Unleashing Their Perspective. And so that's gone really, really well. And the TEDx came out of that book. And, there's been a big focus for me. As I say, I work with everyone, particularly in the leadership space, but I did find myself working more and more with women and really looking at that theme of gender equality. And my take on power is that I think traditionally that there's different perspectives on what power is. So you've got the more sort of traditionally masculine power, which is very strong and directive and powerful. And then you've got the more female power, which is traditionally more about emotional intelligence and influence. And you can even hear through my voice when I describe each of those two ends of the spectrum, that there's a much more of a softness associated with the perception around female power. And I thought, well, why on earth should it be like that? Why shouldn't everyone be able to access that full range? Why shouldn't everyone learn from everyone else and be able to tap into their full ranges of power? And so, a lot of the perspective was around why should it be polarizing? Why should it be binary? Why should it be one thing or another? And so I was already started to look at what gender is and what it means. But still at the same time, I was talking about men and women and looking at it through fresh eyes. This has been a very, very recent thing for me, because clearly, we met about 3 years ago, didn't we? And I saw you speak and you moved me to tears, actually, the first time I saw you speak, Joanne. And listening to your perspective and your story and the people that you work with and represent and the whole perspective around trans and non-binary and what that means already started to just open up my eyes. And then more recently, I've got 2 daughters, right? 14, 17. And my youngest, the 14-year-old, more recently has started to, they both go, well, she goes to a girls' school. The other one has moved on, and she now goes to what originally was a boys' school and now is mixed because she's doing A-levels. But the point is that what she was doing was starting to question, why is it that teachers should refer to them all as girls? And why is it that it should be so simple as the two pronouns? And how about, opening up people's eyes and the teachers and the pupils and everyone around them to the perspective that not everyone subscribes to that, and that actually everyone has a right to choose where they are, whoever they are and however they are. And so that's really the fresh perspective on gender that really my eyes are being opened up to now through my own children and through where I think the world is going.
That's fascinating to hear, because we as parents often feel we're the ones to do the educating. But what we're learning now is that we're learning so much more from our children about their world and about their future. And we're now more responsive. And I think maybe when we go back to our childhood, we didn't believe as children we had that empowerment, did we? We would tend to do as we're told. If we don't speak, if we're not spoken to, it's kind of attitude. But now we're now empowering our children in a different way to speak up, aren't we?
That's right, and I think that's a beautiful thing, and I'm so grateful. I trained to be a coach when my youngest was about 2, and I'm so grateful that I did that, because when I did that, I learned to really listen and learned to really just have that curiosity around the fact that everyone is different and everyone deserves the right to have their own opinions and to be able to express it, which kind of inspires a lot of what I do in my professional world. And so I learned and I trained to do that. And I really hope that kind of finds its way into the way that I am a parent and how I do empower the young people around me.
Yeah, it's taken several centuries of programming by the state, by the media, by Hollywood, to just reinforce this gender binary, the brave, strong man and the soft, fragrant woman, if you like. And that's been reinforced. You look at some of the Disney cartoons of yesteryear, the Snow White, the Prince Charming, the helpless woman, the saved by the man, slay the dragon stuff. We really had that programmed into us for decades and decades and decades. And it's really hard to overcome those stereotypes now, isn't it?
It really is, but I think it is interesting that corporates are waking up to the potential of not thinking that way. I think it's Pixar. I think they've got a new movie that they've come up where they've got a non-binary person who's being featured, and then you look at some of the toy manufacturers, and then they're less like that. You'll have a mix up. You won't just have the Barbies with like the big boobs and the tiny little waist and the kind of pink outfit and all of that. They are mixing it up a lot more now. And so I think that it's all accelerating. So I'm fascinated to be able to kind of project into the future to see where we're all going. But I think if I look back to when I was a child and going through being a teenager and stuff like that, I mean, being gay was illegal, right? And and hidden away. And I remember my uncle was gay and he died of AIDS, and at that time my parents could not tell anybody. It was secret, it was taboo, and it was so. And now that's, at least in my view and the world that I operate in, that just isn't even a thing anymore. So I think everything is changing. And I think if we want to really live in this world, we all need to kind of go into it with an open mind. Yeah.
I mean, do you think the world of work is really evolving and changing? I mean, I read Mary Porter's book, Work Like a Woman.
Yeah, I've got it.
There seems to be that perception that in order to succeed as a woman, you have to almost adopt male traits, the loudness, the confidence. And as you said, the feminine power comes from EQ and collaboration, different sets of skills. Are we losing that sometimes when we're trying to create environments where women feel they have to succeed as a man with male traits? Or are we able to push back?
I think that has traditionally been the case, and I know that there are people out there who will train women to speak with a deeper voice, or to look at bringing in more sort of masculine clothing. And but I actually think I hope that that's in the past now. And so I think the more enlightened corporates are much more open minded when it comes to that kind of thing now. I work with men and women, and what I will say is that when it comes to gravitas, my definition of that is, commanding respect, getting taken seriously, standing out from the crowd. Then you have to think about your voice, and you have to think about the messages that you're communicating. And so, and I look at the difference between how approachability comes across, and how that comes across through your voice. And you can already hear me as I'm saying it. My voice goes lighter. It might go up at the end of the sentence because it's got that lightness. But if people want to have that credibility and that gravitas, then your voice will naturally go down. And, I do share that with everybody in all my classes, because it does make an impact. But that's not about becoming more man. It's just about playing with depth and gravity and seriousness and authority. And that does come with having a more powerful voice.
I've heard that before from someone. They talked about uptalk, which is where you go higher at the end of the sentence. And that almost implies a lack of confidence, or you're asking a question. You tend to finish a question with an up. And so having the power and closure is almost a down talk, isn't it? Where you land that.
Exactly.
And root it.
Exactly. It's interesting. Earlier this week, I was running a session, and I had 3 Aussies on the program. And so I was describing this. It's like, the uptick, it does sound like every statement becomes a question, because you're asking, but you might not be asking. And so actually, if you want to make a point, and that actually, you're describing the Aussie accent here, whether it's Aussie or whether it's from LA or whether it's any teenager, that uptick is... Yeah, I mean, you don't want people to become inauthentic or sound like robots, but it's just knowing if you really want to land a point, then if your voice goes down at the end of the point, then it will land.
Yes, completely, because it's a full stop, isn't it? It really is a close. And if you want to get that point, it's a real divider. I mean, I made a conscious decision when I gender transitioned 4 or 5 years ago. I toyed with my voice, the confidence I had, and whether I wanted to change my voice to sound more feminine, go through voice coaching. And I decided that it was my voice. And I didn't want to change who I was that much for everybody else. I changed my appearance, my identity, everything else. But the thought of changing my voice, it would just overburden my thought process. I'd always have to be conscious of it. Always have to be thinking about how I was speaking. And I decided that I was going to keep my voice. And in some ways, I guess it's an advantage, because I still have that deep gravitas about it. But I don't uptick at the end generally, unless I am asking a question. And also, it does create a little bit of shock and awe when I'm on stage, and I stand there and hold that pause at the beginning before I speak. And I've had a number of people who've literally sat back in their chair going, wow, where did that voice come from? Wasn't expecting that completely. So it's a great attention grabber. So I've learned to use it to my advantage and put up with the misgendering or the confusion it causes negatively, if you like, because our voice and the way we present is very, very powerful, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And yeah, it's interesting. I've thought about my voice as well, and if you think of gravitas, sometimes people's perception of gravitas is it's a statesman-like quality. That's, how it was originally defined back in Roman times. And so the traditional perception could be is that if you've got gravitas, then you are a man, and, statesman-like quality has emerged like a fine wine over the years, and you've got the silver hair and all of that. Clearly, I'm never going to be any of those things. As a fairly petite female, blonde female, so, but my take on it is that that's great. And so one of the first edition of the book, I chose to put my face on the front to say anyone can have gravitas. It doesn't matter who you are. You can find a way of developing it, find your own way of developing it. And I like that shock and awe. If you do the same as everybody else and conform to what people are expecting, then you just kind of bland. You become bland and you merge into the background.
I mean, over the last few years, I've had many conversations with other women, either in the bar after the event or in coffee breaks, wherever you're talking. And I've met many women who have a confidence, find they're not being heard. And of course, my socialized brain is listening to the way they're talking, thinking, well, I can completely understand why you're not getting heard, because you don't have any gravitas in your voice. You don't have your sentences aren't structured in a way where I know what you want. They're kind of drifting. And I think that is some of the challenges that many women I've spoken to who have kind of lack of confidence, is they don't know how to be confident to start with and put themselves in a situation where they speak with authority, that maybe the uptick is occurring because of that nervousness or that anxiousness they feel about rejection or being talked over, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that can be the case with men and women. And I think that it takes practice and it's absolutely learnable. I think what people often do is they feel like once they finally got the spotlight, they feel like they go overboard. They try to justify, they had all of the information and they go around the houses and the nuggets of information, or they get lost. I think when it comes to women, and when I wrote the book, Power Up, I was really clear that I wanted to get tangible evidence and real research to back up what I was saying, because I wanted to make sure that the research demonstrates this, and not just like that sort of traditional perspective of it's harder for women, right? Because there's a big backlash on that as well, and female conditioning, the way that girls are brought up, like you were talking about before, we do get told to sit still, be quiet, not make a fuss, be pretty, go play nicely, and girls are encouraged and conditioned in that way, whereas boys, they go run outside, play, be loud, get into fisticuffs, and that's almost celebrated as well. And so, those roles or those expectations get formed really, really early on. So that happens. And so, there's that society's conditioning. And so I talk about that there's the glass ceiling, which, there's society's perspectives on to the extent to which women can progress and develop within organizations and who is expected to be at the top of those organizations. There's the glass ceiling, but there's also glass bricks that women almost have in their own head that stop themselves from putting themselves out there. So that conditioning, things like perfectionism, imposter syndrome, trying too hard, being the good girl, these are all glass bricks which get in the way. So it's not surprisingly that when the woman finally gets a chance to speak, it comes out jumbled and there's all of this stuff that gets in the way. But it doesn't mean that it has to be the case. It's about how do you learn to overcome that? How do you structure your thinking? How do you get clarity in your thinking? And how do you use some of those techniques around being heard, things like pausing, to make sure your message lands?
I completely agree. I've had so many more conversations with other women in the last 3 or 4 years than I ever had in earlier in my life. And I've met some amazingly strong, powerful women who don't speak loudly. They don't speak with any aggression or pushiness, but they're just so thoughtful, so considered, and they really are at the top of their game. And they show me every day that you can succeed by really being authentic and feminine, but know your mind. And I'm not saying don't suffer fools, but be wary of the fact that people are going to maybe look down at you or undervalue you, but hold your ground, hold that strain and say, no, I am good enough and my opinion is valid. And I have lots of conversations with women, and I really see that and respect that in them. And it's
yeah. And it's learned though. It's for all of us. It's learned. It comes over time. But I think there are more powerful blockers in the way for women because of what I've just described there than there are for men. And I meet a lot of women who say, "Oh God, I wish I'd met you 30 years ago. I've wasted so much time getting in my own way. If only I knew some of these things when I was in my 20s." A lot of the meandering, career-wise or vocally, wouldn't have happened.
Is it a male trait that men tend to be more competitive or more feudalistic towards each other? There's a lot more jockeying for hierarchy within men that is about winning, conflicting and taking charge, where women were more, is this too stereotypical to say, more collaborative, more nurturing, more respectful of each other? So we don't tend to get into those conflict conversations with each other. And men have been practicing this kind of bravado and socialized into that, which is why maybe women struggled in those environments where they need to have a conflict or be forthright. That isn't a natural skill they've learned over the years.
Yeah, spot on. And so, I think it's how do you approach conflict or challenging conversations? Do you go into them knowingly and choose to put yourself out there, or do you shy away from them altogether? So there's that. It's the choice. It's how you behave, but it's also what happens afterwards. Because what often happens with women is that we'll hold on to things. We'll replay things that have happened, and whereas men will just kind of let them go. It's like there was a conflict, there was a disagreement, there was a bit of sparring, and then it's just gone. Whereas women will just hold on to that, and it will stop them from then going into a similar situation after.
Yeah, I see that from both sides of my life. I see the difference in the way that conversations are closed and resolved. As you say, a couple of broken noses and it's a slap on the back and a pint and it's forgotten. Whereas women, it's a lifelong grudge or a lifelong disagreement, and it's really hard to resolve that cold argument, isn't it? The hot arguments resolve quickly. The cold arguments, once they freeze, they kind of set in, and it's really hard to overcome those.
Yeah, and I think and when women don't do that perhaps if they are colder or harder or more direct or stronger, then they'll get labelled in all different ways. So they'll either get labelled a bitch, or they'll get labelled a tyrant, or they'll get labelled a queen bee. And so, a queen bee, I guess, syndrome is a slightly different thing because, a woman has sort of decided to kind of put herself in that position and she'll trample over other people to get to that place. So that's a slightly different thing. But you kind of question what would be different if it were a man evidencing those kinds of behaviours. And actually, would those behaviours end up getting celebrated and enable that person to kind of rise up through the ranks? As opposed to being held back. I don't know. It's expectations of what we think is the right way to be and isn't. And I think, the fresh pair of eyes thing is thinking, well, why should it be like that? Why should any of it be like that? Why can't we all celebrate, all of our differences? You think about emotional intelligence, I actually think that is a superpower that we all need to develop and progress with. And I remember running a session a few years ago now, but it was for an investment bank and it was all men, 20 men and me. And it was like, right, today we're going to explore emotional intelligence. And you could see 20 pairs of eyes all rolling. It's like, what is this fluffy stuff we're going to talk about now? What was she going to be banging on about now? And I think it has changed. I think it is evolving, but still there's that association that we place on the more intuitive powers that they're softer or they're lighter or they're less valuable. But actually, I think the reverse is true.
I just pick up what you're saying about when we try to introduce men to the fluffier side of EQ, then it reminds me I was on stage in San Francisco, and I was on a panel, and the topic was effectively gender equality in the workplace. How do we level up? And I was asked the question, and as I was asked the question, I was thinking. I looked out into the room, and there must have been 600 people. 2 blocks of 300, corridor down the middle. I just looked around and said, isn't part of the problem that we're talking about gender equality and the room is full of women? There are no men in the audience. Where are the men? And okay, there's probably 8 to 10 men in the entire room of 600 on a session about gender equality in the workplace. And gender equality, racial equality, disability equality is always occupied by the people with the characteristic, not by the allies and the enablers. And changing the world to be more gender equal, to give more equity to women, is actually a male challenge, not a female challenge. We know what we need. We know what we want. How do we get men to listen? How do we get men in those conversations and so it's relevant to them? It can't just be when a man has a daughter, he suddenly becomes woke to the idea. That's the excuse. And now I've had a daughter, I now get it. Well, surely you should have got it 20 years ago. Why now?
Yes. And I can relate to that so well. And I remember when I launched the book, and this was back in the day, we were actually allowed to meet in physical rooms.
Old days.
I know, I can't wait until we go back to that. Last January, I launched Power Up, and we had 100 people in the room. Within that 100, we had Alan Stevens came, who's a speaker and a coach and a good friend of mine. And he came, and I had the cameraman there, he was there, and my husband was there, right? 3 men and 97 women, and including my 2 daughters. And we came to the Q&A, and one of the first questions was, so, it's great that we're looking at gender equality, but, there's a lot of pressure on our young men these days. And if you look at the suicide rate and, they're under a huge amount of pressure to how do they need to be? What does their role need to be now? And I, totally get the question, totally agree with the question and answered the question. But before I did, I said, isn't it interesting that we've got a large majority of women in the audience here tonight, and we're talking about a book that is for women, and one of the first questions that guest gets asked is, how can we make it better for our men? And so that as well, it's like kind of preaching to the converted that you were describing, but also we as women, we want to make sure everybody is okay, almost to the detriment of ourselves. So back to the question of how can we turn that around? And does it always have to be when a man on the board has had a daughter who's had an experience, who then has a word that he then thinks, oh yeah, maybe we should look at that. Maybe we should look at our quotas. What can we do? And what I find when I'm invited to work in organizations, and I don't know whether you get the same thing, but often I get invited by, we're the gender equality group, or where, we're running a session for International Women's Day. And so, it's like they're a sort of bolt-on grassroots kind of group of people who want to do something about it. And so they have, I guess, a minimal share of voice and a minimal budget to pay for. And I'm like, well, if you do really want to do that, then you need to do it top down, bottom up, grassroots, but also from the side as well, where you're looking at changing policies. You need to look at the entire infrastructure of an organization, whichever element of diversity and inclusion we're talking about here. And so, I think it does require people to push back and go to, actually, what are the business benefits of doing this? If you look at a truly diverse and inclusive workplace, look at the increased engagement, the increased retention of staff. You look at the results that people are delivering, and you look at the staff surveys and look at how happy and fulfilled people are. Measure, use the data to compare. That's how you do it. You can hear I'm fired up about this.
Greg, picking up on something else you were saying earlier about the Me Too movement and how that kind of put a fire in your belly as well. And we're still not making tangible progress, aren't we? We thought it was a middle-aged, old white man problem. And now Noel Clarke, the BAFTA award-winning black actor, producer, director, a younger person, a millennial, is now being called into question about his own treatment of his female colleagues, people of his subordinate, or whatever it may be. So it's not just an old white man problem, is it, that we were talking about 2 or 3 years ago?
Mm. Yeah, there's something going wrong there, isn't there? You think about the role models and how they're behaving and what was perhaps perceived as okay before, or actually what's happening that's making people think that it's okay to behave like that. And there's been there's been some dramas at my children's school recently, and there've been some attempted abductions as well. And it's the way they've coming back and they're kind of reporting on how this is being covered in their schools and how it's being communicated. It's like, girls, you need to watch out for yourselves. You need to keep yourselves safe. And this is happening. And they're furious. It's like, why should it be on our shoulders to keep ourselves safe? Where's the education of the boys around what is the right way to be? And, that certainly is beyond my expertise, but I do think it's quite interesting how and why this is happening.
You think men too easily forgive other men's behaviours because maybe inside their own head thinking, that could have happened to me, or I could have overstepped. Do you think that's a thing?
Maybe. That phrase, boys will be boys, it's just such a corrosive thing to say. I don't know. I think everyone's different, and we have to sort of start with the people that we know and the people around us, the people we love. And
there are the proportion of men who are vocal is a lot less than vocal women about. I'm not saying there aren't men talking out, but most of the people talking out about Noel Clarke, talking out about institutional racism, etc., tend to be black people. Most people talk about sexism, tend to be women. It's not the people who are on the side of, I say the side of the problem, the people who have influence in that space, in that privilege. Those aren't the people who are standing up and saying, yes, I could do better personally. I know I can do better, and I'm going to do better from now on, and I'm going to call it out as well. So we're not spreading that momentum through men, through white people, through able-bodied people. I was watching a program on the television last night with Leanne from Little Mix, talking about tokenism as a black person in the group, and how the Sony media executives wouldn't meet and talk about the fact that she didn't have any black or non-white support within her crew, and just how she felt she started to be feeling she's been tokenized as the token black girl for media, and couple that with her gender, with her sex, with the fact she's a girl, a woman, and her color. We're still propagating this, and we can still see that the power is held by the rich white guy still, and it's propagating it.
Yes, and absolutely. And if we're thinking about kind of looking at the world through a different pair of eyes, of course, that demographic that you've just described there, they don't see any need to look at the world through a different pair of eyes. And actually for them, it's threatening to do so, because it just knocks sideways their whole worldview and their whole perspective on how things are and how things should be. So, it's fear-based. And so they're going to hold on tooth and nail to what they know and what they have. And so I do think, though, with the way culture is evolving and how most young people are being educated and are thinking and are influencing one another, I do think that things are going to change and develop. And from a values perspective, I think that things are moving on. I think that those kinds of old-fashioned behaviours and perspectives, that eventually, before too long, those people are going to retire. And I'd like to think, looking to the future, that that will be replaced by a much more open-minded way of looking at things.
I think you're right. I think there's you say protectionism. I think there's a feeling that people are worried that they're going to lose what they've got, their cozy world. They've fought hard to get where they are. They've built up whatever they built up. And maybe they're concerned that people are going to come at them with pitchforks and burn their house as a racist or a sexist or whatever. And maybe there is an element of protectionism. Or maybe there's also an element of naivety or ignorance, that they really don't believe the problem is as bad as people say it is. Maybe I often hear people, well, racism isn't that bad. I've got black friends and they're not like that. Or I know plenty of women and they're not talking in this way. And so do some women almost give permission to men to say it's not that bad? Is there no solidarity? Or when women don't experience sexual abuse, discrimination, or oppression, they assume that everybody else is like them and that it's okay, they must be overreacting. Maybe if they grew up and became more mature, they'd be fine, or they dress differently, or they behave differently. Are other women effectively down-talking the problems of other women?
I think that can certainly be the case, yeah. And so what do you do? Do you try and turn around everybody who is in denial or holding back or disagreeing? Do you try and change all of their minds, or do you try and go with the people who are already converted and supportive of the message? What do you do? And I actually think, I think the answer is about telling stories, telling actual stories of people's true experiences and painting pictures of what it actually is like so that people can relate to it, and doing it rather than doing it in a preachy way. Because if someone tells you what to think or what to do, and you see this in social media all the time, then everyone is, the other person is just going to dig their heels in and resist. Whereas if you do it kind of round the back door through telling stories and evoking images and, painting pictures, then people are going to be much more open to starting to think about things in a different way.
I completely agree. I run quite a few workshops around inclusion and belonging, conscious bias. And the most powerful element of those is when I have the privilege of hearing the stories of people on the workshop. They're brave, they stand up and say, this has happened to me. I've had people who are black talking about being stopped and searched, people who are black who talk about being followed around supermarkets. I've had people who are black who talk about various aspects of being denied access to services or just feeling like they're always a threat. And I've had young women who actually aren't that young, they're in their 30s, are being talked down to because they appear young. They're shorter, they're smaller, they've got a very young-looking face, or their hairstyle is long, which makes them look like they're in their early 20s. And how they've been passed over, spoken over, assumed they were the junior rather than being the manager. And just hearing these constant lived experience stories where the pattern is always the same. It can't be individuals making this up. But I think we heard the story when we were talking about Sarah Everard, the hashtag "it's not all men," but then that was repeated by the hashtag "yes, but it is all women." Every woman has a story. Every woman could talk about how they've been denied opportunities or there's been overt sexism. And even women that say, well, I'm okay, have probably become socialized into believing that what happened to them was okay. It's just the way women are. And that's what happens to women.
Yeah. Yeah. And exactly. And I think when you start to tell those stories, then people, they remember, they think, actually, no, I do remember that happened to me. And in fact, whether we, we represent a protected characteristic or not, we will, all of us have had some experience at some point in our lives where we felt powerless, or we felt squashed, or we felt like we couldn't actually express ourselves, and we felt bullied in some way. And when you take people to that experience and then they relate to it, if you can then attach a message around, how can we ensure that this doesn't happen to other people? That's when you start to inspire change. And for me, the story that I told at the start of my TEDx, it's an emotional story, and I'd never told it before. And it was my first day at primary school, and so I grew up just speaking French. And it was my first day at school, and it was an English school. So I didn't understand anything that anyone was saying. And it was loud and people were running everywhere, and I didn't know where to go. And I remember lunchtime, I had this food put in front of me, and I was like, oh, what on earth is this? And I just didn't know what to do with it because it was so foreign to me. And I remember spitting out some of the food into a water beaker, and the teacher came up shouting at me, like, oh, what have you done? That's disgusting. All these children looking at me and just feeling completely powerless to speak or defend or say anything. That feeling, and feeling gagged, actually, that feeling that you just can't speak. And I think that feeling is the feeling that you get when someone is imposing their power over you and you're powerless to do something about it, whether you're being attacked or verbally or, overtly or whatever it is. That feeling that you're powerless is just such a horrible feeling, and we have all had it. And I think some people do is when they have experienced that, they kind of toughen up and they think, right, my response to that is I will never let that happen to me again. So they then become the person who has the power over others. They exert their force and their power, and then it gets perpetuated. And so it's that feeling of vulnerability, that fear, I think, that stops people from allowing themselves to be vulnerable. And I think if you tap into that, if you meet people at a place like that, then if you do that, you can bring people around.
Yeah, I think so too. I think for sure. Yeah. So COVID has been a major, in my opinion, it's really set back gender equality in the workplace and in the home environment. We talk about the rise of violence against women and girls because of the lockdown, because of those tension situations, the amount of refugees that are providing support now to women who have suffered domestic abuse at home. But also from a work perspective is that it's set back careers because women, and let's put it out there are many relationships where there are either same-sex couples who are men, there are modern families where the man and the woman share responsibility, or the man does most of the care. So I'm not talking about those great relationships. I'm talking about the typical majority of the relationships that still exist, where the woman is still the primary educator, the primary caregiver, the primary home admin person. And the extra burden through lockdown has meant that these women cannot focus on their career. They've maybe lost their position in the queue for promotion, opportunity, training, development, or they're really just barely treading water in their role. How do you see the society and the world of work correcting this? Because we've got to play catch up now.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's evidence to show that the pandemic kind of put gender equality back by a decade for all the reasons that you've just described there, where in extreme cases, women have had or have felt like they've had to make the decision to step away from their career, stop working altogether to take on those care responsibilities at home. And actually another stat which is quite interesting is that in the pandemic, if you look at people who are in research, the submission of research papers actually increased by men. So more men submitted clinical papers, research papers to be published in clinical papers compared to women, where the research papers decreased. So there's something interesting going on there with what people were doing with the time that they had when they were working from home. But as far as what can we do about it is concerned, I've certainly noticed coaching women and just eyeballing them, through the screen and seeing them in their home environment, just at their complete wit's end with juggling, homeschooling, and holding down a high-powered, high-stress job, and with no time left for themselves at all, no time. for anything really. And so it's no wonder that, a lot of people have just found it too hard and stepped away. I certainly remember in the career that I had, I worked in PR communications before I set my business up. We got to sort of the age of where women were starting to have families and taking on career responsibilities. It's like, where have all the women gone? Because it would just become too hard to hold down a challenging job that's full of global travel and really, really long hours, pitching the business, all of that. Impossible to do that with a young family, which is one of the reasons why I set my business up, actually, because I just couldn't do all of that and have a family at the same time. So you kind of you multiply all of that with the pressures that we've had over this past year, and it's no wonder that gender equality has been set back. What can we do about it? Well, I have observed that what a lot of the more enlightened organizations are doing is they're really looking at how can they create an environment of trust where people can work more flexibly, and as long as they're delivering results, it doesn't matter actually how many hours they're doing or how they're doing it or where they're doing it. None of it matters as long as they're delivering results. So I think that the more successful organizations and the more attractive organizations for people are going to be the ones which are going to make life easier for people as a result of the pandemic. Because in that sense, we've got the pandemic to thank for that. Hopefully cultural change within organizations is going to move in that direction.
I hope you're right. I'm still seeing so many examples of workplaces trying to fall back into the traditional back to the office. And there's still this kind of, if I can't see you, I can't trust you. And that command and control, that old school way of working where we measure people on presenteeism, time sat at the desk. And we're still not, even after the pandemic, we're still, a lot of business still haven't learned about how they can manage people asynchronously, set work, set milestones, set objectives, not being constantly in interactive meetings. We can message people and get responses tomorrow. Set the agenda so that you don't have to keep track on everybody day by day or minute by minute. But this is still going on, and I see so much pressure now to push people back into the office without considering the anxiety. I mean, we're still, even on the news today and last night, we're talking about this Indian variant of the COVID. I would predict we're still not going to be allowed on public transport or in shops without masks for a while, whatever that while may be. So people's journey to work isn't going to be as it was. People's workplace experience isn't as it was. There's no longer do we get each other coffee because we have to have our own cup. There's glass screens around everything. We're socially distanced in our office. So people have got anxiety now about going back into the workplace. And just by the very nature of how women and we are socialized, we have more anxiety because we're worried about our impact on others, our caring responsibilities, our elderly parents, our children. We're not self-centered. We're not just, a man often just thinks about themselves and go, I'll be fine, and minimizes the risk. So the difference in approach to return to the office is completely different from a gender perspective, I believe. And we've got to be careful we don't ignore the anxieties and the feelings of women pushing themselves back into an environment where their mental health, their well-being is going to suffer as a result of this. I think, as you say, some companies are looking holistically at people, speaking to people as individuals, understanding their anxieties, and building a work shape that works for them, rather than it being a cookie cutter, everybody's in the office, everybody does this. And I think that's going to define the good companies and the bad companies, is how person-centric they are and how they listen and really communicate with their people about what is the best way of working for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I was speaking to a head of HR earlier this week, and she was saying it's really challenging actually for people working in HR at the moment because they've got such a wide spectrum of people who are working for them. So for people from one extreme where people are like, I don't see what the problem is, we should all go back to the office now anyway, and it's going to be fine, and let's just crack on and get bit and moving again, all the way to the other extreme where people are still terrified of even leaving their homes. And so how can you be inclusive and cater to that entire spectrum of people? And they simply don't know the answer to that question, but ultimately there needs to be some form of decision or stake in the ground. But how are they going to do that? So you might have people who are happy in the office, they forget to put a mask on, and then they meet someone else who is really out of their comfort zone with that. So, and then it then becomes the responsibility of the individuals to be assertive enough to say, I need you to put your mask on now, which is a challenge in itself. You see it on public transport all the time. So I don't know, it's a unique challenge, isn't it? None of us have ever done anything like this before. So yeah, it'd be fascinating.
My wife was furloughed in the early stages. And then she was, I say forced, she was put in a position where she had to return to the office on her own while other people were furloughed. So she was literally the only person permanent in the office every day, apart from engineers visiting to collect parts, for 3 months. And she found that very stressful because that was in the middle, probably about summer last year, where it was wasn't locked down. It was locked down, but it wasn't enforced stay at home, I think. So she was feeling very uncomfortable here about being the only one in the office. She couldn't fight back. She couldn't push back to come and say, well, actually, I don't feel it's safe. She could have worked from home because, lo and behold, when the stay-at-home order was given in December, magically she was given a laptop, magically she was given a phone. So she could work from home. So we know that she could have back then. And of course, now what happened is early April, the government advice kind of changed, and then they wanted everyone back in the office. But we know she can work effectively from home. And so their culture and their organisation is one about pushing people back into the office, knowing full well that they work very adequately, spread disparately from home, because they have the cost of the office. They've got a traditional kind of management structure where they want to see people and count people and check they're there. And they haven't evolved. They're not evolving. And this is, okay, there was a small business, probably 50, 60 people. But given that most people in the UK are employed by small, medium businesses, 67% I think it is, that pervasive culture is going to be within our society, and people are going to be pushed back. And organisations, because they're paying £3,000 a month for their office, they want to get some value from it.
Sure.
So that's conflicting priorities.
It's an engineering firm.
My wife works for it's a installation service company for heavy plant. Yeah.
Right. So I wonder whether there's going to be a distinction between the more mechanical engineering, traditionally, I guess, masculine type organizations compared to others. So
creative,
yeah, exactly.
Artisan, marketing, white collar type stuff. Yeah,
exactly. Are you do you speak for Vistage?
I don't speak for Vistage, no, but I know of them.
Okay, so I'd speak for Vistage, and so they're a global organisation, and it's for MDs and CEOs from small to medium-sized businesses predominantly, and different groups all around the world. And so I speak for Vistage. So I through the pandemic and before that, was speaking to different Vistage groups around the UK. And through the pandemic, what I've noticed is that, for in those organisations where it's more about, sort of engineering or factories or, those kinds of organisations and companies, then there's been much more of a push to go back to the workplace. And clearly it would be if you've got factory workers, if they're manufacturing product, they need to be in the office.
Yeah, you have to.
Right?
Yeah, you have to put stuff in boxes and pack and load and return, yeah.
So
the area my wife works in is the office side. And they have field engineers. Yeah. So they don't manufacture, they have field engineers they service. And they that they bring in stock to install. They don't manufacture stock, not in that office. So, yeah, it's. I think it's tradition. It's just the office exists, therefore we'll use
culture. Yeah, the perspective and perception. Whereas on the other side, I've heard a number of the banks. So I think Metro Bank, they've closed down their office in London. everyone is going to be
in Holborn. Big office there. Yeah.
Right. So everyone is going to be working from home now. And you think about the Googles and the Facebooks and, the large advertising firms and all of those. A lot of my clients, they're not going back to work for the foreseeable. And many of them possibly won't. So, yeah.
But that's a challenge for the government, for infrastructure, because then what do you do with all the trains? What do you do with all the underground? What do you do with the public services and transport in inner cities? What do you do with all the sandwich bars? The infrastructure is built up around servicing those office blocks. So it's a real dilemma for government and infrastructure to be able to make sure that you're not losing jobs in one hand by creating flexible jobs on the other.
Exactly.
Because if the city of London empties, just think of the millions, or certainly hundreds of thousands of people whose jobs are at risk because there's no one for them to service anymore.
That's right. And you also think about the psychological impact that it's having on us as humans. I used to travel around all the time. I'd be, on a train to London, 4 days out of 5, possibly one day out of the weekend, always hauling my bag around and doing my thing, live in person. And now, even though things have opened up, just the thought of going up to London is just like a bit of an effort. Do you know?
Don't want to. I know.
Can't be bothered. And so, we just need to get out more as well, I think, as human beings. Otherwise, we're going to forget how to be sociable and how to practice those kind of interpersonal skills that we all need to bring richness and life to ourselves and to the world. But we do need to learn how to break through that.
But I often say that people keep saying we need to socialize at work, about how work is this magic thing when we meet partners, we develop relationships, all those things. I said, well, how about we change the paradigm? I say we actually need to socialize at home and locally. If we have more time in our lives without commuting, more time in our lives where we have the flexibility at home, then maybe we have more time in our lives to do extracurricular activities, join a club, join society, have a hobby, do outside interests. And we can bring that socialization into our home environment and not feel that we've missed it from our work environment. I think we keep trying to retrain ourselves back into the office to say, well, that's where we get our socialization, only because that's our mindset. We've commuted for 2 hours there and 2 hours back. By the time we get home at 8 o'clock in the evening, we're burnt out.
Right.
We don't want to socialize at home. But if I finish work at 5:30, I turn my computer off, I stand up, and it's sunny, I'll sit in the garden, have a cup of coffee, enjoy the sun, or I might go for a walk or go for a cycle or do something else. I've definitely got the freedom of choice about what I want to engage in. But I think when we're slave to the rhythm, slave to the machine of work, then that's what people are trying to force us back into is to switch back into the old way of thinking. And I think we need to just change what I want from life is less commuting, less time where I have no control over myself, and more opportunity to live my life and that work-life balance, yet still work hard, deliver, earn a good living, and be in contact with people. So it's trying to find that balance.
It is. Yeah. What are your thoughts on
don't want to end up on a plane?
You're not
I don't want to fly around the world anymore.
Don't want to do that anymore. You don't see yourself back on a stage in San Francisco.
I think I would do it differently. I think
might say yes. I've got Francisco.
I've got an opportunity to speak in Newcastle at the end of June, and I've got a bit of anxiety about that because the talk I'm giving, I created virtually online.
Right.
I've never given this talk face to face. So I've kind of got this stage anxiety about, I've currently got monitors, I've got screens, I've got lights, and I've got all this control with the push of a button. And suddenly I'm now vulnerable on a stage trying to engage with real people. Wow, I've forgotten how to do that.
You're going to absolutely love it. I think, just sort of questioning how I feel about going back out there and delivering, whether it's courses or whether it's keynoting live again. And I never thought I'd say this, but there's a lot to be said for just doing it from your office. And And you can sparkle, you can engage, and you can get amazing feedback, even if you're speaking to like a blank screen and staring into your camera. You can still get the vibe that you could still feel when you're connecting, can't you?
Yeah. I mean, I used to find it really challenging to deliver where I couldn't see the audience. So, a traditional webinar format where everyone can see you, but you can't see anybody.
Yeah.
I used to find that really hard, but I saw nobody. But suddenly my brain just gone, it's okay. I know they're there.
Right.
It doesn't matter. I know they're there. I know they can hear me. And I get a round of applause at the end, so I'm fine. But what I still struggle with is the pre-record. So I'm talking to the camera. I can't go over that not live, because my brain knows it's not live. And my brain says, I made a mistake. Let's do that again.
Yeah, I know that one. Yeah, yeah.
Whereas if I'm delivering it live, my brain knows that it's a one take and it's fine. But as soon as I know I can edit it, my brain just crumbles.
Yeah.
I've got to try and learn how to talk to that black mirror with nobody on the other side of it and one take in the same way I would even if I couldn't see the audience. And that's what I struggle with.
I guess it's that perfectionism that we were talking about right at the start, isn't it? It just starts rearing its head. It's like, it could be better. It could be better. You could do it again. Oh, come on, let's do it again then.
I'm delivering a talk to the French Professional Speakers Association. I think it's next month. And when I applied, I thought, okay, that sounds good. I knew it was going to be online. And I get an email saying, we want all the speakers to send a pre-recorded video and then be available on the day to do like a live Q&A after the event. I thought, you want me to record this? And I had a deadline of, I think it was last Friday or the Friday before.
Yeah.
And I left it like we do. You leave it to the last minute and you think, well, okay, I've got the opportunity here for 3 takes. I delivered the first one. I was 8 minutes over. I thought, okay, I'm going to try and chop 8 minutes off of this. Delivered the second one. And I was so worried about going over that I kind of lost my train. I felt unnatural. And I watched it back and thought, I loved the energy in the first one, but it was too long. The energy in the second one, I thought was a bit flat, but it was just the right length. I thought, okay, I've just got to send you the one that's the right length. I've just got to send it to you. And I'm being overcritical. I know it was probably my own mindset that I was wrestling with rather than what I delivered. So I sent it off to them and they said it was great. It's fine. It's on the agenda. So.
And that's the thing, isn't it? That is a classic glass brick you just described there. It's like, it needs to be perfect and we're not going to get there. I remember when I applied for my TEDx, and again, I kind of left it until the last minute. I got an email on the day before saying, well, thank you for the written submission, but we need a video from you. And I only opened that email when we were literally driving down to the Kent coast to go camping. And I was like, well, normally if I was going to record something like that, I'd get it all set up, do the lighting, make it all nice, but I was in a field with my phone. So I slapped on some lippy and my friend was like, Antoinette, why are you putting lipstick on now? We're camping. I was like, I just need to go and do something in the car. Put myself in the car and there were people putting tents up all around us, noise of, children running around and stuff. And I just recorded this thing and managed to get just about enough reception to send it and sent it. And it was fine. You think, well, I should put so much pressure on ourselves to make things perfect.
I know.
Well, actually, first take is good enough.
Yeah. And there's a huge psychological difference between live and recording yourself. I'm sure you probably felt the same there, that suddenly you've got this perception of it because you can watch it back and go, I don't like that.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're live, you don't see yourself, do you? And I never watch the recordings of me back. I wouldn't want to do that to myself.
Oh, I do. I watch the recordings back, because I always ask my clients if I can record it and, put together show reels and things. And I watch them back and I'm like, I remember that bit when I fluffed that thing or said that completely wrong or forgot to do. I remember that laughing to myself on the inside of my head and pressing on regardless. And I often say this to people when I'm coaching them around that, how they're like, oh God, I'm worried that I'm going to forget something and all this. No one knows and no one cares. Even if they do notice, they don't care. So just have a little laugh on the inside and keep going. And actually it makes you more authentic, doesn't it?
Yeah. You're right, completely. And I have listened to some of my stuff back when I've gone to subtitle it and things like this. And what I realise is there are so many times when I'm speaking and I don't finish the sentence. I get halfway through a sentence and then go off on something else. I think that didn't make what I just said just didn't make sense. I didn't even finish what I was going to say.
That's deliberate, though, isn't it, though, Joanne? That's a nested loop right there. You open the loop and then you come back to it later, don't you?
I think that's. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show that when we're talking in real life, that we must do that all the time. Conversation gets interrupted, sentence gets interrupted, we wander off, we come back. But when we listen to ourselves back, we spot this because we knew what we were going to say. We didn't say it.
But that's what makes a lovely, authentic conversational style, I think. I mean, we don't like that sort of back to the statesman-like gravitas. I'm going to deliver a powerful message. It's all scripted in advance.
The Toastmaster style.
Oh, yeah. God, it just doesn't work, does it? I remember coaching this guy, and it was a 2-day authentic presentation skills course in America. And there was a guy, and he came in, and he was like one of those classic kind of silverhead fox types. And I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. And he said, yeah, I've taught myself, I've ironed out every verbal tick. I have no more so's and likes and you knows and things like that. And it was true. When he first did his first presentation, it was like, this is like listening to an actual robot. Because it was just message delivered completely dispassionately. And it's like, right, we need to bring back some of you into the way you talk. By the end of the second day, it was so much more engaging. So I think, often people get coached, do this, do that, talk deeper, leave these things out, say this, be authentic, do this gesture. And you end up ironing out the whole essence.
The podium like this and a power pose. And
I know. Or if people get told, fake it till you make it. It's like, for goodness sake, please don't do that. Don't try and be somebody else until you finally figured out who you are. Start with who you are and build out from there.
People will love you for it. People will love you for being you. If you love yourself, you're happy with yourself, be yourself. And that's all you can ever ask, isn't it?
That's what moves people. Yeah. And we all need to come back to that, I think. Because when we do, then we make change.
We've been rabbiting on as we have. We're absolutely engaging conversation. And so tell us a bit more about your book. Tell us a bit more about how people can get in contact with you. And please, tell us all about that.
Okie dokes. Well, there are 2 books. There is the Leading with Gravitas, and I'm literally just about to launch the 2nd edition of that on the 4th of June, in 3 weeks' time from now. And that is all around what this intangible thing called gravitas is, how you can create your own version of it rather than trying to be like anybody else. There's a whole load of content in there around remote communication and how you can make the most of communicating in a virtual environment. There's a brand new chapter on leading yourself, your teams, your organizations, leading through change. So that's the first one. And then the second one is the one that I mentioned launching a year ago, which is Power Up, the smart woman's guide to unleashing her potential. And really that's for anyone who wants to accelerate their career through their organization by starting with who they are. Both of those you can get on my website or Amazon or any online bookstore. So those are the books. And then if people are interested in working with me, I run a couple of open programs. There's a Gravitas Masterclass a couple of times a year that people can come along to. There's a 2-day Gravitas for Women course. All information on all of that is on my website, AntoinetteDaleHenderson.com, as well as information on my coaching as well.
Simply LinkedIn, people can track you down there.
Yeah, find me LinkedIn and Instagram, Antoinette Dale Henderson. And come and say hi if you've got any questions. Let's link in, let's connect. And I would love to have a conversation with you.
Brilliant. I'll put all of those details in the show notes. So if you look below, you can click on them and find out. So Well, thank you. I really enjoyed that. I could have carried on talking for another hour. It was absolutely amazing and fascinating to have a really deep conversation with you.
I really enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. And a huge thank you to the listener. I'm amazing that you stuck with us. Tell us what you think. If you've got friends and colleagues, please tell them. I'm sure that you're not alone. So please do tell them about the Inclusion Bites podcast. That's BITES. Do subscribe to keep updated on future episodes. I've got a number of other exciting guests lined up that I'm sure you'll be inspired by over the next few weeks and months. And of course, if you'd like to be a guest, let me know. I'd welcome any comments, feedback, or suggestions on how we can improve the show. To email me, joe.lockwood@seachangehappen.co.uk. So finally, my name is Joanne Lockwood, and it's been an absolute pleasure to host this podcast for you today. Catch you next time. Bye.